disciplines and make an estimate of the firepower and whatnot. It's in a way, I guess it was an interesting job, but I don't think I'd care for that for a steady diet. And we were out at another little interesting thing I ought to tell you about too is candy. A lot of people would send candy from home over to the servicemen, and especially when we was at that base there at Subic Bay, where there were a lot more different men around and some new ones, and you could tell how long a man had been over there when you'd see him open up his pack of candy. Now over there in the tropics, you can't keep anything. It's your clothes get mildewed and everything molds and rots in very short order, and candy, by the time you get it over there, it's wormy. And you'd just watch the fellows, if they'd open up their package of candy and see the worms in it and turn up their nose and not eat it, they hadn't been there very long. If they'd take the end of their knife and kind of flick the worms out of it and then eat it, they'd probably been there for a few months. But if they just took a look at it and shrugged their shoulder and ate it anyhow, then you knew they'd been there for a while. It's a good thermometer to judge how long a man had been over there. We were sent out on a patrol, and one of these little patrol craft, PCs they called them. And when one was going to go out on a run, they'd pick a crew. They carry a crew of about 30 men. And it was after Chichijima that we were out in one of these patrol craft, and I'm not sure where we were, but I think we were somewhere between Okinawa and the Japanese and the Chinese mainland. And we saw a mine floating in the water. We seen it ahead of time. We were coming right up on it. I suppose it broke loose from its moorings, and well, we tried to steer away from it. But when you steer in a ship, it's the fantail that turns, and so we'd made hard right rudder and had got the bow pointed away from that mine, but we was right onto it already, and then we turned hard left rudder, and we'd almost made a complete turn with that mine just making a circle there in the eddy of the water, just going around and around before it finally reached over and nudged us, and when it did, it blew. That blew in one side and out the other of that little patrol craft. Of course, we had radio silence and all this, but the engine room was still floating. We'd hit that mine toward the fantail end, and the engine room was still watertight, and our forward hold, there's just 3 holes in those small ships. So we were sitting with the bow pointing up toward the sky, and the hind end sagging kind of low in the water. Well, before they decided to abandon ship, we pumped the forward compartment full of water and wrung that down, so we were on fairly even keel, although we didn't have much freeboard. We were just about wading in the oceans all the time, but our screw would still turn and our engine would still run, so we had turned around, and we was not going very fast, but we were making steerage way, but the sea kept getting rougher and rougher, and this was in August in 1945, and finally the weight of the seas breaking over the top and beating our deck, and we was leaking water from the top. We couldn't keep it out of the engine room anymore. So in the meantime, I had we were all living topside then up in the superstructure, and we had emergency rations, but we had bread and we had Spam, and and such things up there too. So everybody carried a gas mask. All through the war, you had to carry that gas mask. It was just part of you. So I decided that gas mask wasn't really much good to me. So I took the gas mask out of the case and made me a bunch of sandwiches and out of bread and spam wrapped in wax paper and stuck them in my gas mask case and kept that around my neck at all time. And finally the order came to we had to abandon. We couldn't pump the water out anymore. And the water raising in the engine room, when I hit that boiler, something's going to blow. But so we launched our rafts, and the sea was getting very rough. Now there was a hurricane. It was going through that area at about that time, and we were getting kind of the outer edges of that hurricane. So we launched our rafts. All we had to do was cut them loose because we was already just about ankle deep in the water on the deck when the deck was at its highest. And I'd got into the water and was trying to reach that raft, and that wind was blowing away pretty fast, and I wasn't in no mood to get left behind at a time like this, so I was swimming pretty hard, and you're always trained that when you're in the water and you're expecting an explosion, you should be on your back because there's quite a bit of concussion in the water when there is any kind of an explosion. So, but I was in kind of a hurry at that time, so I had my life jacket on and I was swimming as hard as I could. And finally, one of the guys had tossed me a line from the raft, and I'd caught onto it about the time the water got up on that boiler, and she exploded. So there was quite a concussion in the water. It squirted me up out of the water, and I was aware of a little discomfort and whatnot in my belly, and I knew I got quite a shock. It was about the same thing as if you laid on your back and spread your legs, and somebody took a big wide plank and come down and smacked you right in the belly, right down the middle. But anyhow, I did make it on the raft, and after we were on that raft, the time becomes kind of hazy because after a day or so, you're so miserable and exhausted, and you're sort of dehydrated. You don't get as much water as you should. We had emergency rations of water, and we had these K rations which is a little box, something like a little Cracker Jack box, that kind of stuff. And after a while, I remembered those sandwiches I had, and so I broke out one of them sandwiches and was eating it. One of the guys that had just won the whole payroll in a crap game just a day or two before we hit that mine, so he was carrying most of the payroll, and he'd won it all in a crap game. And he said, "Hey, I give you $5 for half of that sandwich." And of course, I told him, "No, you go ahead and eat your $5." So he started bidding on half of that sandwich, and then he was getting quite noisy there. He was getting rather demanding, and of course, I wasn't seeing any reason why I should share my sandwich with him. But we finally got the attention of the commanding officer, and then he confiscated my sandwiches. Then they were divided up evenly. So I did learn a lesson on values, on what something was worth at a time like that. $1 million was worthless, but the sandwich was pretty precious. So that's a little lesson that's stayed with me all my life. Eventually, we got back. We were picked up after 5 days. We were picked up by a Limey destroyer, and after we were picked up by that ship, I could appreciate the cleanliness on an American ship. That ship was downright filthy. The human stench had come up out of the hatches when you'd open them to go down below, and that ship that would hit you. And if you weren't sick before, you soon were afterwards. But everybody was sick. My feet were badly sunburned. I had lost my shoes, and the skin was raising up off of my feet, and of course my face. The lips were swollen, and all they had to eat practically on that Limey ship, as far as I could see, was mutton stew. And the saying goes among the Navy personnel that you can smell a Limey ship before you see it because of the mutton stew that they eat. Well, I could almost appreciate the truth in that after that little experience there. But anyhow, we were picked up, and they did bring us back into Subic Bay, and we landed there at Subic Bay, and our officer was trying to muster us. And another thing that had happened while we was on that raft, we saw a few Jap planes go over, and that's something we hadn't seen for quite a while. Of course, we were radio silence when we was on the ship, and we seen those Jap planes go over. Everybody that was in the raft would go over the side because they had a nasty little habit of, they've seen a life raft out there strafing that raft with machine gun fire. But these planes went on by and they didn't molest us. And we found out that while we were there on that raft, the Japs had surrendered, and I suppose that was some planes coming back to make some kind of arrangements for the surrender. But this was after the two atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Now, I suppose stateside that was big news, but among the servicemen over there, we'd heard about it. It wasn't such a big deal there as it probably was back stateside. But anyhow, it did bring about the surrender of the Japs. I don't know how history will judge that. Maybe some of you will live long enough to hear about it, but maybe it was an error, maybe it wasn't. It did save an awful lot of American lives at the time, but what we did then, I guess we traded off Jap lives for Americans. I mean, maybe in the eyes of God, maybe that's not too right either, but anyhow, it's over and it's done with, and there ain't anything we can do about it now. That's all we did. But after we got back to Subic Bay, it was real chaos there. There was just no order to anything. The records was all messed up, and people were going home, and some of them were loading up to go up to Tokyo Bay. And well, my first thought was, that I should have enough points to go home, but after we tried to muster for a day or two, then they come down one day and arrested a whole bunch of us for being AWOL. They didn't have any record of us even going out on that PC. And my pay records, of course, all sunk with the ship I was on, and to this day I have 14 months pay coming that I never did collect. But they arrested us all for being AWOL and took us down there, and they had us in the barracks for a couple of days, and then they come down there and picked out a group out of here to put us on a PC, and we were going up to Tokyo Bay. And I got picked in that bunch, and we went up on another PC craft, went up into Tokyo Bay with the fleet that went up in there for the surrender arrangements. And I don't remember how many days that was after the Japs had agreed to surrender, but now they were going up to sign the official papers, and they were going to do it on the USS, either the Missouri or the Iowa, I forgot which, one of the battleships anyhow, that was Halsey Hall's flagship, and him and General MacArthur were going to accept the surrender of the Japanese. But they did send a group of us in there, and I can say that I've been in Tokyo Bay, but we never got ashore there. I can see now that their intention was they sent a group of us in there, and some fellows had landed on the Ginza. That's the main street there right in Tokyo, and they rode a jeep up and down the Ginza to find out whether invasion was going to be peaceful or otherwise. I suppose we were there just in case it was otherwise. But the following day, we were sent out ourselves and quite a few other ships, and we went back down to Subic Bay. So never got to see any part of the surrender formalities, but we were up there in the bay anyhow. That's as close as I've got to Japan. And after we got back to Subic Bay, I was having a problem finding any records. My pay records and everything had gone down with the PC that sunk, and every day they'd hang a big list of the guys that were to get on the transports to go home, and you'd go and check those lists, and your name wasn't on it, and there's quite a feeling of dejection. That they would, boy, before they get us all straightened out, I'd probably rot on this island. And in the meantime, my buddy and I, when we hadn't got on a muster sheet to be shipped out, and then they said there wasn't going to be another one for 3 days, we decided to go down to Manila. So we stole a Jeep and gassed her up and went down and spent a day or so down in Manila. I got quite a few pictures taken while we were down there in Manila that time. We saw these little horse-drawn taxis, which is one little bitty horse, and then a big high-wheeled cart with a top over it, and the body of this cart sits behind the axle, and the little horse is in front of the axle. You get a couple of great big American GIs sitting in that seat behind the axle. That poor little horse was almost lifted off the pavement. The streets of Manila were a whole series of little bridges where it's built out close to the bay. They're all stone bridges, and they all have an arch in them, and so you go down those roads, it's up and down, and them little horses had a terrible time trying to make the up part with two GIs in those carts. I have some pictures of those taken while I was there in Manila. Someplace among our souvenirs is some pictures of that. Finally, we got back, and when I got back, some of the guys I knew said, "Hey, you're missing it. Your name was on a muster sheet. They run another ship in here, and you're supposed to be on it." Well, I went and looked, and sure enough, by golly, here was my name on there, and the guys was already formed up already down on the beach where they take the landing craft and walk them all into the landing craft and then haul you out to the boat. So I went down there and grabbed my ditty bag. All I had for clothes was what I was wearing, and that was a pair of dungarees cut off above the knees, and a white skivvy shirt and a baseball cap. That was my total uniform, and my little ditty bag with my shaving gear and stuff that I accumulated after our PC had sunk. So I went down there, and I did get in that group, and when they were mustering them on, they was already alphabetically past my name, so I just got into one of the boats and managed to get in there and got out there and loaded us up on the ship. And then when I was coming on the ship, they pulled me off because my name wasn't on the list of guys that was supposed to be on that boat. And there was quite a few of us that had tried to pull that. And then before the ship was going to lift anchor and go, they were doing a lot of checking, and a few of the guys got pulled off and put in landing craft and taken back, but I managed to stay on, and I got shipped home. So going home, we went by the Northern Passage, which the Japanese current that makes a big curve. It goes up past Japan, but I guess it cuts sailing time. But we were 17 days coming back from Subic Bay to Portland, Oregon. We went up the Columbia River, and we landed at Swan Island in Portland, Oregon. And after they'd unloaded us there, while we was on that transport coming home, I got to thinking and dreaming about food back here stateside, and the thought had come into my mind about pancakes, and the drool had run out of my mouth. You would think that a guy would dream about steak or something like that, but I didn't. I dreamed about pancakes. So we landed in. We finally got to Portland, Oregon, Swan Island there, and they unloaded us, and then they took us up to some barracks. There was kind of a boot camp there. Of course, I didn't have no blues, no uniform, no nothing. And so then they said before the trains weren't going to be ready for the next day or two, and anybody that had proper uniform could go uptown. So, well, they had the laundry lines out there for these boots, and of course there were clothes hanging on there, and they have the guard watching them with a wooden rifle. But there was an awful lot of guys in the same fix I was. They didn't have any dress uniforms left. They lost them. Mine was sunk. So we went out into that laundry lot there where they tie their blues and stuff, and we grabbed off uniforms and gave the poor little old boot guard a bad time, but we did manage to grab enough clothes so we could go uptown, all but shoes. I didn't have a decent pair of shoes. All I had was old split cowhide amphib boots that we used to hit the beaches with. But I went uptown anyhow, and it was about 4 o'clock in the afternoon when I finally got uptown in Portland. And of course, the first thing I do is go to a restaurant, and they ordered some pancakes. And the waitress said, "Well, we're not served pancakes this time of the day." And I thought, I don't care about time of day. I want pancakes. And whip me up a batch. And she said, "Well, you'd have to go talk to the cook." So I went out in the kitchen and talked to the cook, and he said, "Well, these all the pancake dough I got is some he'd been dipping rabbit in to fry rabbit." I don't care what you've been frying, I want pancakes. So, well, he said, "If you want them that bad, I'll make you some." So he whipped me up a batch of pancakes, and I ate them, and then finally, they tasted just as good as I dreamed they would. And then it occurred to me that, hey, I'm back in civilization now. I don't have any American money, not a dime. I just had Filipino pesos, which is the money that we'd issued over there, and I didn't have a great deal of that. But I managed to dig up enough pesos, and of course the girl didn't know the rate of exchange, but they were pretty good to me. They took my pesos, and we got back to camp, and then we got on one of these, what they call a cattle car. Some of you newer generation won't know what a cattle car is, but it's a car they used to use to haul troops around with. It ain't anything like a civilian passenger train, I'll tell you that. There's little cages in there, and there's 6 men to a cage. You sleep in hammock, in little bunks that are just some pipe with a canvas stretched in between them, and they stack them up 3 to a side of a stanchion, and there's 6 of them there. So then there's a bird cage, a wire cage around each one of them. So then you're partitioned off in little groups of 6, and they can get more guys in the car when they do it that way. But anyhow, we took off and we're home, and nothing like it was when we were going the other way. When we was heading out there, we was on the best trains there was, the fast ones, and it didn't take us very long. But now we got sidelined for every kind of a train that came along, and it took us 4 days to come from Portland, Oregon to Minneapolis. And well, there was one stop in Havre, Montana. I remember when we got there, and they posted guards at the end of the cars and said, "We're only going to be here for a few minutes now, so nobody's to leave this train." Well, Havre isn't a very big town, and so each compartment or group took up a collection, and then we were going to appoint one runner to get off that train and run uptown and get us a jug, some kind of drinking liquor. So, well, I got elected for our group in our little bird cage, and so the windows, we opened up all the windows, and as soon as that train came to a stop, there was guys pouring out of the windows on all sides of the train. The guards standing at the doors in the end, screaming to stop and stay in there. But you could look down the length of that train. It must have been about a mile long, and you could see servicemen, mostly sailors, coming out of that thing from all sides. Everybody heading for uptown. Well, I was pretty fast, but by the time I got uptown to the little liquor store, the first one was all sold out already, and I had to go on to another, and all I could get was a jug of rum. So when I come back, I got a little bit of static from my shipmates there because I hadn't got a very good quality of whiskey, but I did get a jug of rum. I guess it wouldn't have made much difference. You can blow your brains out one as fast as the other. But then the last day we was on that train was Thanksgiving Day in 1945. And while the eating we had done in that car, they had a car that looked a whole lot like a boxcar, and they had canned heat. I don't know how many of you are familiar with what canned heat is, but it was glycerin and alcohol mixed in a container, and then you light it, and it gives off pretty hot fire. And they had those set in little racks along the side, and then they would cook hot dogs and make hot coffee, and that was our fare all the while we were on that troop train, except for the last day, Thanksgiving Day. All we had was the biscuits. We'd run out of the hot dogs, and there was no more meat to put in them. But before we got to Minneapolis, we was getting kind of hungry. By the time we got into Minneapolis, kind of late in the day. Of course, everybody's hungry as a bear. This was the last stop for that troop train. Everybody was on there was going down to Wool Chamberlain Airport. That's where they run us all down to. We got down to Wool Chamberlain, and they said, "Never fear, we're going to give you guys a Thanksgiving dinner." Well, we finally had a turkey Thanksgiving dinner at about 10 o'clock, 10:30 that night. So we did get some food. I was there for a couple of days. They run you through all sorts of tests, and then they'd run onto this shrapnel in my neck, and then I had injury, and they said in my belly, they said I had a varicocele there, so I'd have to go down to Chicago and get that shrapnel removed and get an operation for that varicocele before they'd send me home. And I said, no way, I ain't going down there before I go home. So I finally convinced them that I was going home first before I did anything like that. So finally got on the train, and they sent me home. And I remember the morning I got home, and little old Bill, he still scooting along in the seat of his pants, but he never forgot his daddy. I walked in the door, it was kind of early in the morning. I got in there on the morning Tunerville, and I walked in the door there, and little old Bill, he started screaming, "Daddy, Daddy, Daddy," and he come scooting off across that floor, and we had quite a reunion there at home. Well, very glad to make it. And a few things had happened while I was gone. And one thing, Pete had been playing around with a fuel oil barrel we had in one house we was living in, and he managed to set the curtains in the house on fire out there by the fuel oil barrel. Ma got that put out. And then one time when I was home on leave, the basement was full of water, and I'd rigged a pump down there by the basement window, and had that pump all rigged up, and then I opened up a light switch up the head of the stairs and hooked a couple of wires in there, and then I was going to walk through the water over to that motor and hook the wires on, and I decided I'd better appoint Pete to keep that switch, otherwise he might throw that switch on while I was in that water. Well, so I appointed him keeper of the switch, and I took the ends of them wires and was walking through that water, and I got halfway over there, and he threw the switch. I couldn't say anything. I went down underwater, and the next thing I could hear when I come up, I could hear Pete laughing. He'd turned the switch off again, and before I could tell him, "Don't do that," he hit me again, and he ducked me twice. I don't know how come it didn't kill me. I was standing in water clear up over my knees, and it was just about up to my hips. And he hit me with that full load out of that switch. But anyhow, I I did get it wired in, and then found out I couldn't pump the water anyhow. It was just like we were sitting in a well. That basement was always that full of water as long as we lived there. But while I was gone, Mother moved out. Grandma had bought a house up on the hill, and after Grandpa Pete had died, and they were all living up there. That's the house that you kids will remember, some of you, and that's where we were living when Art and Dale were born. Anyhow, it must have been probably about the first part of December when I got home, and I said, well, I'm not going to do anything until spring. I'm going to go up and sign up for unemployment, and I'm just going to loaf and kind of catch up on living. In the meantime, I know I had this problem with this morphine, and in the first few days I didn't think too seriously about that. I soon got acquainted with the local doctor there, Dr. Muir, and find out that he had the same problem too. And so getting the morphine was no problem. That it didn't cost me anything. I just go down to Dr. Muir and get it. It's quite simple, and we finally worked out a method whereby we put the morphine in a cabinet there in his office, and we had a double lock on the cabinet, and he had one key and I had one, and neither one of us could get it without the other there. So the last while that I fought that battle, we sat there a good many nights and drinking whiskey and trying to talk each other out of having a fix. But among our souvenirs, there's quite a few letters that the kids had sent me and stuff while I was overseas. Some I'd sent to the kids. And I'm sure among our picture boxes and the souvenirs that we have around here that there are quite a few of those left. A day or so after I got home, I'd taken the old Model A Ford, which Mother had been driving all the time I was gone, and I'd paid $25 for that car before I left, and didn't value it very highly, and I drove uptown and I double parked, which is normal in Browns Valley, in front of the post office, and went in and got the mail. And Maricles run a restaurant there. They had an old dog, Sooner, they called him. It was some kind of a Chesapeake or some sort of dog. They needed a big, tall dog. They called him Sooner because they said he'd sooner eat than anything else. But Sooner had come charging off the sidewalk, and there was ice and slippery sidewalk on the streets, and he'd come running out there, and here I was double parked, and he tried to slam on his brakes, and of course he went down and slid on his belly, and he slid right under my car just about the time I was getting in it. And not being very bright, he didn't know enough to crawl out. He tried to stand up, and every time he'd stand up, he'd raise that old Model A Ford. He just had her bouncing up and down, and then he was baying at the top of his voice. You could hear him clear up and down Main Street. So I'd leaned out of the car, and I was looking underneath, and they say, well, lay down and crawl, you stupid son of a bitch. And about that time, a voice behind me said, yep, that's just what he is. And here was Father Kunkel. The first I'd seen him after I got home. He was a very good friend of mine, and I felt very unnecessary with that kind of language, but I guess he called it right. That's exactly what that dog was. But anyhow, and I talked to Slim Pryor then while I was in town, and he'd come over to shake hands with me, and I hadn't seen him for some time, and which was normal. The first few days you were back, seeing the old town, the old timers, and all your old friends that you hadn't seen for some time. And Slim says, I'll buy your car from you. And I said, well, how much? And he said, $250. I said, Slim, you're crazy. That car ain't worth that kind of money. And he said, I'll pay you right now. So he whipped out the money which he carried in the bib pocket of his overalls and counted me out $250, and I said, "Give me his money." And then I remembered I had to go up to Wheaton, so I said, "Hey, I got to go to Wheaton tomorrow. I keep the money until I get back." And he said, "No, that's all right. You take the money, and then you go to Wheaton when you get back and bring the car up to my place." So I said, "All right." So the following day, then I went up to Wheaton and signed up for my unemployment, and I knew where Slim Pryor had always lived. I thought it did. But what I didn't know is that Slim had rented out that house to Stella Purkeiser there in town, and he had a room in the hotel. So, and after I got home from Wheaton, I had supper, and it was after dark, and I drove over to Slim's house, parked the car there, and went up to the back door, and was going to go in and tell Slim that the car was here, and I rapped on the door and jerked the outer door open, and which was a screen door, and they had tar paper over it for the winter time. And then the next door was a door with a window in it, and here I saw Stella Purkeiser with the old wash tub taking a bath there in the middle of the kitchen floor. Of course, Stella stepped out of the tub and was running toward the door to close the door. And of course, I laughed, and I said, "Well, tell Slim his car is here." And she said, "Well, Slim don't live here anymore." And so that's how I found out that Slim Pryor had moved. But then I didn't have no car, so I figured, well, I mean, for $250, I should be able to buy a pretty good car. But I found out that during the war, things had changed. You just didn't buy a car that way. So, well, I had to have a car, so I went out to the old city dump, which I knew had a whole bunch of car bodies and car engines and everything in there, and I did pick a car body out of there, one that didn't have any engine in it, and then I picked a V8 Ford engine out of there that, it had a hole in one of the cylinder walls, but the crankshaft wasn't rusted up and everything, so I took that out of there and went up and rented a stall there in the Chevrolet garage, and they had a boring bar and a reboring tool and all that there, so I bored that block out and put a wet sleeve in it, in that hole in that cylinder that had the hole in it, put a set of pistons and rings in it, and got the engine running, put it together, and I made me a car. Well, the first trip we took with that car, my mother and I then decided I was going to go down to the city and see about getting the move back into our own house there on 1103 Chatsworth. And of course it was bitterly cold, but that car would really move out. And we drove down to St. Paul, and we got down here and find out that I can't get into my own house. That they had an OPA. It says it would take me 6 months to get into that house. Well, I was a little bit bitter about that, so I raised the rent on the guy that was in there, and I couldn't make him leave, but I could make him sign a lease, which he didn't have before. So I upped the rent on him, and well, then he wouldn't sign a lease, and he said he was going to move. So, okay, you've got to move, but you better pay me the back rent. And I was having a little problem getting that all squared away and settled. So I got, to hell with it. I'll just sell the damn house. Well, when I went to sell it, then I found out about those condemns that was on there when I was digging that basement and all that stuff. But we did manage to get that red tape all squared away, and I sold the house for considerably more than I paid for it. But it was, if I had been looking into the future, I certainly wouldn't have sold that house. I would have hung on to it. But anyhow, we get back to Browns Valley, and people kept bringing me work in that garage there, and I just rented the shop and the garage full time and hired some more mechanics and went into the business there because I just couldn't seem to get out of there anyhow. And well, while I was running that garage there, and another thing that happened is my dad came over there one day. I had gone home for dinner, and Dad came over and he said, "Would you help me here? I got a little problem." I said, "Sure. Well, whatever the problem is, so come in and have lunch with us." So Dad came in and had dinner with us, and then we go over and I find out he was up on that church roof, the Catholic church, trying to put tile back in there. While his rope had got stuck in the crack between the tiles up on the peak of the roof, and he couldn't get loose all by himself. So I went up the ladder and climbed the rope up to the peak of the roof. When I got my head up over there, that roof, boy, that wind was blowing like crazy up there. It didn't seem like it when you're down on the ground, but I got that rope unhooked out of there, and then I was going to try to help him, and boy, I got so shaky up there, I just couldn't do it. And so I got down off there and said, "Dad, no way, I can't let you up on that roof again." So went and hired Spidey out here and got him a jug of whiskey and get him to go up there because Dad, with his high blood pressure, I couldn't see any way that we could let him up on that roof. Anyhow, Squint and I later on decided that we'd better do something about that, so we talked it over and we took Dad's tools and got out and sold them. And I kind of felt bad about that ever since. I just, that just wasn't the proper thing to do. I'd hate to have my boys do that to me now, but I can still see some of their way of thinking. They borrow my ladder anyhow, and they don't bring it back. So I guess they're sort of thinking in the same way. But in the summertime, later on in the summer, after it started to get hot and everything, that problem I'd picked up on that foot over there when we was in the mud and the stuff over at Lingayen Gulf, which I thought was just a temporary thing, and then my feet had got blistered so bad when we were on the raft. But that had gotten so bad, and my foot stunk so, and such a horrible mess that I decided I'd have to do something about that. I just couldn't wear shoes anymore. I couldn't get my garage work done. I was there to boss them in, so I went back down to, I think that was in the summer of 46 or 47. I went back down to Fort Snelling, and they checked me all over down there, and well, they tried burning it, and they tried cutting it, and they tried freezing it, and then finally they said all they could do for me was take that right foot off. Well, I wasn't in favor of that, so I said, no, I'll go home and I'll play it the way it is. So I went home feeling very dejected and all that. I don't know how in the hell I could work, but one foot looked just like a big rotten mass of garbage and stunk to high heaven. And so when I got home, I was sitting in the chair wondering what I was going to do, and then Grandma had been telling me about she'd had a dog lick her leg when she was a young girl, and some sores that wouldn't heal up. And after she had that dog lick that leg, it had healed up. So we had a dog there. I had gotten him the winter before. I was going down to the garage one day to go back to work. Well, I was going to walk home. I left the car in the garage because it was just too damn cold out there for a car, and so I left the car down the shop, and I was walking home, and this little dog started following me, and he was really thin and run down, and I was about the only guy out there on the sidewalk, and that dog started following me, and obviously it was an Indian's dog. So I turned around and told him, "Well, you better go on home, doggy. It ain't fit for no dog out here and this stuff." And so he'd belly down on the sidewalk, and I'd walk away, and I'd look back, and he was still following me. So I finally said, "Well, come on. I guess you're just as cold, hungry, and miserable as I am." So he went up home with me, and we got up there, and Mom said, no, we ain't going to have no more dogs, not while we're in town. It's too much of a heartache for the kids. So I said, well, okay, but you can't send this dog out without feeding him and look at him. Well, that was it, we fed him and there was no getting rid of him after that. We called him Schmaltzy. He was a short-legged dog, like a wiener dog, but he had long hair and a nose somewhat like a collie. He had a long pointed nose and didn't seem to be much good for anything, but